Weekly Shonen Jump's Sakamoto Days is a manga about a shop owner and assassins, and while the series is starting to see an uptick in popularity, I still think the manga is woefully underappreciated at large. So today, I'm talking about Sakamoto Days and why I think it's so enjoyable, the appeal of it, and overall, what makes the story so cool. For people curious about this manga who haven't checked it out quite yet, consider this my sales pitch on why you should get into the series expeditiously. And for long-standing fans, just kick your feet up for a few minutes while I gas up this magazine's coolest series. Sakamoto Days is one of those manga that just oozes aura. Now, I know that word has gotten beaten to death by anime and manga fans recently, but unfortunately, there aren't too many words I got in the chamber that define exactly how I feel about Sakamoto Days and what makes it so entertaining. Obviously, one of the reasons the series is as popular as it is comes from the fights. In fact, from a visual and creativity standpoint alone, I don't think it's all that crazy to say that Sakamoto Days is one of the greatest series when it comes to combat, especially when only looking at manga that are currently publishing chapters. The action is so good in this series that I even made a whole video dedicated to singing its praises and comparing it to some other manga that do fights really well, and while I'll do the same thing later in this video, first I want to talk about an aspect of the series that goes slightly under the radar, at least relative to its fight choreography, and that's the character writing. Now, yeah, I know, the characters are a big reason people like this series. How did I figure that one out? And yeah, sure, well, I'm definitely not earning any extra credit for my creativity and my deep diving. I do think that there is something so smooth about Yuto Suzuki's character writing, and it massively contributes to why this story has such a positive reception from fans both new and old. Sakamoto specifically is a very good protagonist, but in a way slightly different from what you might expect given my phrasing. I wouldn't necessarily call him a super nuanced or complex character like, say, a Thorfinn, a Kaneki, an Eren, or a Guts, but I would call him deeply charismatic and enjoyable. To say he isn't well written would be a disservice to the time and effort put in by Suzuki that allowed him to craft Sakamoto to the perfect amalgamation of traits which make him simultaneously super badass, approachable, kind, and funny. That dichotomy between a lovable family man just running a convenience store and hardened assassin who can kill you in a million different ways is simplified, condensed, and demonstrated visually by his transformations. Well, yes, he can and will beat your ass 7 ways to Sunday while in his fat form, and is known to be compassionate in his skinny form. It's quite obvious that Suzuki uses these transformations not only as a way to quickly change up the tone of the situation, letting the audience know that things are getting real, but to also give the readers a very blatant dichotomy between Sakamoto's past and present, the family man that he is today versus the hardened assassin that he was in his past. When you think about it for more than a second, honestly, this trope or this writing tool is one of the most basic forms of conveying information like this and showing us how a character that has this sort of dichotomy functions, but sticking to the fundamentals in this particular instance is not a bad thing in the slightest. And in fact, I think it's the contrast between these two modes for Sakamoto that enhances the other aspect of him. Because we know Sakamoto has the ability to be this ruthless killing machine, the strength that he has being used for the sake of his family, other people, and general kindness feels that much more genuine and real. And conversely, because we know of Sakamoto's kind heart, whenever it freezes over or he is forced to take an opponent seriously and really fight for his life, even 150 chapters into the manga, it still feels like an absolute treat and like you are going to be sitting on the edge of your seat for the entire length of the battle. For the time being, I would say that Sakamoto isn't going on any top 10 list if you're looking for a super subtle writing or thematic depth type of character, but I genuinely think the beauty, simplicity, and quality of a character that you're just always happy to see goes really underappreciated in conversations like these. And I honestly think a discussion could be had on whether or not a character like Sakamoto, who is simple but effective, is as good as someone who is super nuanced but maybe not as charismatic in their depiction. A nuanced character that can tell varied stories and convey layered messages is fantastic, and I'll never turn my nose up at that. But that doesn't mean that characters intended for simpler stories, simpler messages, simpler manga aren't equally as good at their job and equally as good at entertaining and enthralling the reader. And Taro Sakamoto is really good at checking all of these boxes. While silent for a large portion of his time in the series due to Shin, who I'll briefly talk about later, we're able to peer directly into his thoughts, and that leads to some pretty funny jokes being casually spliced into the more laid-back chapters of the story. Sakamoto Days isn't necessarily laugh-out-loud funny for the most part, although it does have its moments, but the consistent little jabs of humor add character and a unique flavor to every character and person in the story. What kind of jokes they crack or what reactions they have to a particular person and scenario will allow us to have some insight on who they are as the reader without specifically spelling out what about them is different from everybody else. In the beginning of the story especially, Sakamoto and Shin have this running gag that involves Sakamoto immediately killing Shin or whatever the source of his annoyance is at the drop of a hat, and because of Shin's clairvoyance, we actually get a unique spin on the character that hits people when they act stupid trope that you could see with characters like Nami and Sakura. I'm not even a hater of the base version of it, but making constant use of Shin's mind reading ability to make unintrusive jokes that slightly inform us about Sakamoto's temperament and natural instinct is really, really nice. It helps you get absorbed into Sakamoto, both the character and the world of the story itself. Now, I brought up Shin multiple times in this video, and while Shin is one of my favorite characters in the story, arguably being my favorite and the best, unfortunately, I will not be dedicating an entire segment of me just singing his praises alone. Rather, I want to shift the focus from Sakamoto as the protagonist onto the other characters in the story, because while he functions really well as the main character, there are many side and supporting roles that are simply too cool to not talk about, at least slightly. Obviously, there's Shin, who I already said is one of my favorite characters in Sakamoto Days, and just like the protagonist, I think he's just a really fun guy to read about. He has his own moments of badassery just like Sakamoto, but his journey isn't nearly as complete as Taro's. Sakamoto is someone who's gone through a lot more in life to get where he is now, and many times it doesn't seem to require growth from him to beat villains and handle any threats that come his way. He's no Saitama, he definitely struggles in fights very often, but he certainly starts the series out being one of its top dogs, and I could see this initial elite status growing slightly tiring if it wasn't for characters like Shin who bring the audience back down to earth, really let us know what it's like to be relatively normal in the Sakamoto Days universe. Shin is no pushover, he's no slouch, he's definitely more skilled than he isn't, but relative to the Order members, who I'll talk about later, and Sakamoto himself, Shin is pretty regular. He isn't as skilled as Sakamoto and very often doesn't have the abilities necessary to take on an enemy by himself or with his current skill set, which either forces him to grow or rely on others in a way more comparable to the orthodox shonen main character. But this dichotomy, paired with Sakamoto essentially being his idol, is genuinely compelling. Shin looks up to Sakamoto and respects him more than anything, and this desire to be like him pushes him forward and drives him not to be a burden, but an equal. Very much in line with the tonality of the story itself, Shin happens to have some pretty funny moments, and he's actually genuinely humorous on his own, but in particular the moments where he kind of just can't contain his hype or respect for Sakamoto are always a mix of funny but genuinely endearing. We even see that Shin's picked up on a few of his mannerisms in battle due to hanging around him so much and looking at the greatest assassin ever in his eyes. Overall, Shin's just a cool guy trying to become even cooler so he can stand side by side with his goat, and as simple as the story as that sounds, that's honestly kind of enthralling. Aside from that, the main players in Sakamoto's close circle are Lu, Heisuke, Aoi, and Hana. Aoi and Hana are Sakamoto's wife and daughter respectively, and excuse my French, but oh my god, they are just so adorable and cute. They don't really have much to do with the overarching narrative of the story, but they're pretty prominent in the slice of life portions of Sakamoto Days, and they do a great job of grounding our main characters and giving us some perspective on what exactly it is that Sakamoto specifically is fighting for. They are minor characters in the grand scheme of things, but they do so much early on to lay the groundwork for Sakamoto's characterization and contribute to the family-like camaraderie that those at Sakamoto's shop share. Aside from that, we got Lu, which, rest in peace, her screen time. And on top of that, we have Heisuke. She's fun while she's a main player in the story and bounces off of Shin as this real Dumb and Dumber duo sometimes. But about 50 chapters in, Suzuki kind of just tells her to skedaddle and she just gets phased out of the story, which is a shame. It might be this manga's only miss, depending on what you think. But it's not the end of the world though, especially because the series has a litany of characters just as, if not way more enjoyable than Lu to see on screen. Heisuke's an example of this kind of character. While Lu is very cool and honestly very goofy. If all of Sakamoto's characters fall on a sliding spectrum of genuinely funny to genuinely serious, Heisuke is definitely on the funnier and goofier side. This isn't to say that he hasn't had serious character arcs or fights. In fact, his sniper battle is one of the coolest moments in the entire story, but generally speaking, he plays a supporting role and provides a lot of levity to the manga. The moment we step outside of Sakamoto's shop though, things start becoming a bit more intense and real assassins get brought to the table. The Order and Slur's group are the main two factions aside from the guys I just talked about, and boy do they have some really cool characters. In Slur's group, you have Uzuki and Gaku primarily, who are the obvious head honchos of the whole organization. Both characters take on a slightly more serious tone than average, with Gaku, out of the two, being a bit more of a casual villain in most of his depictions. If you want pure aura though, one look at this page is all you'll need in order to find it. In the context of the chapter that this page dropped in, the switch from regular inked pages to what looks like just a sketch of Uzuki lying in wait was insane, and genuinely one of the coldest uses of the medium I've seen in a minute. Gaku certainly doesn't seem as menacing, but he makes up for this in his fighting style and very blasé attitude around weak characters. In the Order, I'm gonna be honest, there are so many cool or interesting characters that you can choose from, as Suzuki does a really good job of balancing out this faction and making sure that their personalities complement one another. Hyo is really the only one I don't care for all that much, but even Hyo has his own sort of charisma that I think could be entertaining to someone that just doesn't necessarily have my sensibilities. Outside of that, basically everyone is a hit. Takamura is an old man in the Order who is just the definition of violence and power in the universe. Because of this, he has very few fights, speaks even fewer words, but you know when you see him join a battle that it's already over. Osaragi is the Order member with the most comedic value alongside Nagumo, and also one of those characters that is just a joy to see. When paired with Shishiba, they become a super charismatic duo to follow, and I think the biggest contributor to that is their stark personality and presentation differences. Osaragi is very eccentric and silly, while Shishiba is much more conventional, intelligent, and serious, so to see the other character pull some traits out of the other we don't usually see is cool. Now, don't get it twisted, Osaragi is super badass despite how goofy she is, and honestly, I think that dichotomy works really well in a different way than Sakamoto, but kind of in the same vein. In the mix of these guys, you also have Order members like Yotsumura and Kendaka, who don't show up all that much, but are so cool during their brief tenure in the manga. Kendaka is a pretty laid-back, speedy type of character, and while he unfortunately gets nerfed relatively quickly, what he does demonstrate before getting cooked is genuinely so cool. Some of the coolest displays of speed and action in Sakamoto Days, full stop, which is saying something considering what manga I'm talking about. The same goes for Yotsumura, as the one major fight he is in is chock full of crazy one-liners, impressive double-page spreads, and the trademark Suzuki choreography. His student, Shishiba, is someone I already mentioned, and he's one of the coolest Order members in my opinion. He's probably the most serious and conventionally assassin-like, and while that may seem boring in the midst of a colorful cast of unique characters, I think his presence acts as a good dilution of everyone else's overwhelming disposition, which could potentially become too much and actually grating otherwise. Shishiba is like a neutralizing agent, something that keeps everything balanced instead of going wildly out of control. And finally, you have the GOAT, the coolest character in the story, my glorious king, Nagumo. Now, insane glazing aside, Nagumo really is just him. Cool design, cool demeanor, cool weapons, cool fighting style. I mean, everything about him is just cool. And alongside some of my other favorite Order members in the series, I plan to make a video specifically talking about him, just so I can really dig into the Order members and really just dissect what makes them so cool. But what you need to know right now is that the supporting cast in Sakamoto Days is full of really engaging and entertaining people, meaning that when the focus isn't on the protagonist, chances are you are still going to enjoy the goings-ons of the manga. Now, up to this point in the video, I've really focused on the characters and why they make Sakamoto Days such an enjoyable experience all around, but another aspect of the manga that does this is the story structure. Once again, shocker, I know, the story's good? Who would have guessed? But hey, y'all don't come here for my creativity, y'all come here for the analysis. Now, much like Sakamoto himself, the series named after him has two separate modes or versions that it kind of just transfers between. In its initial stages, it's relatively calm and down to earth in its scope, and scale. We still see Sakamoto and crew getting active, don't get me wrong, but compared to what we see later on in the manga, the plot is pretty simple, focusing on a villain of the week and slice of life structure to establish characters, their motivations, their demeanor, and a baseline for what life is like without the stakes being at an all-time high. This is then contrasted by the arcs in the story where the plot becomes far more important and shrouded in mystery. The stakes shoot up dramatically, and the tone of the series becomes significantly more serious, with even Sakamoto facing danger in many of his battles. Now, these arcs would have already been extremely cool and fascinating on their own, but it's my belief that they become even more spectacular, even more awe-inspiring, even more crazy because of the juxtaposition of the smaller scale and calmer arcs before it. The brighter the light, the harsher the shadow, and Sakamoto Days uses a simple tactic like this pretty consistently to great effect. It's actually a tool that many stories have in their tool belt and something they often use at the very start of their mangas, but with Sakamoto Days, things aren't just calm at the start. Between major arcs, flashbacks, or story events that require time to happen, Suzuki slows things down and makes sure to reacquaint us with the characters so that we enter the next stage fully rejuvenated and invested in what is going to happen. As I've said time and time again during this video, the tactic itself isn't super complex, but it's such a useful move to go to that I can't help but commend Suzuki for sticking to his fundamentals and leveraging it to create a uniquely smooth reading experience. Reading Sakamoto Days is such an enjoyably easy time, and it's massively in part due to the things I've talked about already. Now, up to this point, I wanted to make it clear that the appeal of this manga isn't limited to how good the fights look, but come on. The good looking fights certainly don't hurt every once in a while. Now, I've said it once, I've said it twice, and I'll say it till I'm blue in the face. Sakamoto Days fights are amazing. So much so, I think we might need to launch an investigation on Suzuki to see if he's lacing these with something or not, because what this man does with the pen, it just isn't normal. Now, I've been around the block when it comes to creative and cool action scenes. I've seen Naruto fights, Bleach fights, Record of Ragnarok fights, Tenkaichi fights, like you name it, I've probably at least seen it. But I ain't ever see someone light a cigarette from the sparks of a motorcycle, or see a nigga swing his arm as hard as shit to give a gun extra range, or curve a bullet from a sniper rifle. Yuta Suzuki lives and breathes action, and it's so clear in his inventive fights. Truly, he is a master of his craft that stands alongside some of the greats. If you haven't already, and you're watching this video, maybe trying to decide whether or not to get into this manga, check out Sakamoto Days. It's a super cool series, and it deserves even more attention than it already has. Check out this video if you want to see more of my thoughts on the fighting in the series particularly, and comment any other topics surrounding Sakamoto Days if you want to see more of this kind of content on the channel. As always, I hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll see you in the next one.